This podcast is part of the Blueberry Network, where listeners and podcasters come together. Find out more at blueberrywithnoease.com.
The Eat Sleep Right podcast is brought to you by generous grant from the Built on Dreams Media Network, with additional funding by the Sims Media Foundation, and from the generosity of listeners like you.
Stand by, please. Rolling on set now. On set.
Welcome to episode 124 of the Eat Sleep Right podcast. I'm your host, Adam Scull. The Eat Sleep Right podcast is brought to you by Audible.com. Get a free audiobook download at audibletrial.com/Eat Sleep Right. Over 100,000 titles to choose from for your Kindle, iPhone, iPad, or MP3 player. The Eat Sleep Right podcast is available on the site as well as the iTunes store, where you can also subscribe to it. My goal is to find out how writers became authors, how they got where they are, how they do what they do, and go from a blank piece of paper to a finished manuscript. EatSleepRight.net is also made possible by the generous cooperation of Writers World's Facebook group. Join the Writers World Facebook group. Learn how to become a better writer. If you enjoy the Eat Sleep Right podcast and you've had your own adventures in writing, I'd like to hear from you. Tell me about yourself and your story, and I may get back to you and have you as a guest on the Eat Sleep Right podcast. If you have any questions or comments, anything at all, I'd like to hear from you. The email address is comments@eatsleepright.net. Don Massenzio, author of Frankly Speaking, a Frank Rozzani Detective Novel. Welcome to the Eat Sleep Right podcast.
Well, it's great to be with you, Adam. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me today, and I'm looking forward to the interview.
Your chosen genre, detective, mystery, crime. What drove you to this in the first place?
It's really interesting. I've always been an avid reader, and that's been my preferred genre to read. But I've got to say, what inspired me to write my first novel about this subject had to do with streaming video and watching old television series. I was watching The Rockford Files, a favorite of mine from when I was a kid. Just enjoyed the dynamic of the show and the dynamic of the lead character, and that was a big inspiration in writing this first book.
Interesting to think about inspirations. When I first think of detective novels, I think of Lawrence Sanders and his series The First Deadly Sin.
It's interesting that you bring up inspiration from other authors. I had a review that was done for my book. The reviewer said that my writing style was very similar to Elmore Leonard. I found that very interesting because I had never read any of his work. Actually pouring through them now and reading all of his books from the very first to the more recent to see if, in fact, the reviewer was telling the truth or just blowing smoke in the review.
Any other influences you can think of?
John D. MacDonald comes to mind. He wrote a series of detective novels that took place in Florida, where I live. I thought the setting and the way he used the setting was very effective. I'm also a big fan of Harlan Coben. I'm not sure if you're familiar with his writing. He wrote a book called Tell No One, which I think is one of the best mystery, thriller, detective-type novels that I've ever read. The story just engages you from the beginning and carries you to the end, and I try to bring that to my own writing style.
How do you come up with your ideas?
This particular story, I think I had in mind for quite a while, and it wasn't influenced by any current events, but it's interesting that you mentioned that. The first published short story that I have ever written was basically me sitting on an airplane looking through news headlines, and a news headline jumped out at me about an individual who was in a serious motorcycle accident, and that became the basis for the first short story that I had published. And I tend to do that. I keep a notebook of ideas. I'll look at local news headlines, national world news headlines, and pull ideas from them and try to expand those ideas into, what if this story went in a different direction? And that is an inspiration, without a doubt. I think that any author pulls ideas from the authors that they're fans of. I've read every book that Stephen King has ever written. He's actually getting into the detective genre with some of his later work. I've read every James Patterson book. I've read some Sue Grafton, and I think we pull pieces from each of those authors because we like the way that they write. I think that's a natural thing for a writer to do.
Tell me a bit about your main character in your book.
So the main character, Frank Rozzani, has some parallels with my own life. He grew up in Syracuse, New York, upstate New York, very cold winters, moved to Florida due to a family tragedy that totally changed his life. Now living in Jacksonville, Florida, which is where I reside. Those parallels, the culture differences, the change in climate, the change in lifestyle, those all come through in the novel from my own experiences.
Do you remember the first story you ever wrote?
I do. I was probably about 6 years old. I was an avid reader when I was a kid. I lived in a neighborhood where there were not parks and other children to play with, so I read everything I could get my hands on, and I ran out of books, and I started writing a story about a giant that lived among normal-sized people, and it was kind of a comedy thing. And I think somewhere in boxes in my mom's attic, I still have some of those stories. I'd like to go back and take a look at them someday.
Do you remember the first story that you ever read and the impact it had on you to the degree that you said, this is what I want to do, I want to be a writer?
I think that happened to me in high school. One of the required readings for a class that I was in was To Kill a Mockingbird. That's probably my all-time favorite book, and it's really interesting that it's that author's only book that she ever wrote. The different emotions that book evoked, the storyline just blew me away in terms of inspiring me to go in that direction.
Are you an outliner or do you write by the seat of your pants?
You know, the first book I wrote by the seat of my pants, and I think part of it was the method that I used. I was traveling, I was on a project on the West Coast, and I had very long flights. And this was back in the time period before they let you use iPads or other devices while the plane was waiting to take off. So I had a notebook, and I just started writing the story longhand. Quickly found out that I had to flip back and look at character names and look at events that had taken place, and found that writing on paper was not a very efficient way to do that. So the second book that I'm working on right now, I took a little bit different approach, and instead of really doing an outline, I do what I call a mind map. And doing that, I lay out all of the chapters ahead of time. I just put 1 or 2 sentences with each chapter to say what the story event is going to be in that particular chapter. Most of the time, my characters drive the story. I'll sit down at the computer, and it's almost as if they take control of my fingers, and the story just flows out from there.
A mind map. Quite fascinating.
I'm a consultant by day. It's a technique that I've used in the consulting world where you sit down with a client and they give you a goal that they want to achieve, and you draw little boxes with contributing factors to reaching that goal. So I thought, why wouldn't that concept apply to writing a book? I know how I want the story to begin. I have a good idea of how I want it to end, and I need all of the stuff that's in between. And this technique works really well to do that.
You keep all this in your mind. How do you keep track of everything?
It can be a challenge at times. I do have to go back, and I use a tool called Scrivener to do my writing, and it has very good search capabilities, and I'm able to put together character profiles. So I have those reference materials ready at hand, but in terms of the story itself, characters take control and kind of drive where it's going to go.
You say the characters take control. Have they actually changed the course of your story?
It's much like our own development. The characters mature as you write the piece. They have events that affect their lives, and they change. My thinking about those characters changes along with those events. I also like to inject humor into the books wherever I can. I've found myself typing the dialogue that the character is speaking and actually laughing out loud to myself because I didn't expect them to say that, and they'll come up with something witty. Then I realized that it was actually me that came up with that witty reply. It makes me feel good when I'm writing.
Comedy into detective mystery thriller. Do you think that aids or detracts from the seriousness of what you're writing about?
I think it aids the storytelling, and it also mirrors real life. If you think about whenever tragic events happen in your life, I know that my family influenced me in using humor to deal with those things. I remember some of the biggest laughs I've ever had have been at funerals when we remember funny stories about the person who passed away or funny things that happened around them. I think the books are the same way. You build the reader up and you bring them to a point where the anxiety is so high and they need somewhat of a release before you get to the final resolution of the story. Humor helps you do that, and it also helps me lay out the characteristic of the characters that are teaming together in the book. The main character in this particular book, frankly speaking, has kind of a sidekick that is a bit of a wise ass, I guess would be the way that I would characterize him, and he's always injecting humor and making comments that kind of make the main character shake his head and say, why am I hanging out with this guy? I think it's an effective tool.
Then it becomes time for revisions. To wit, I ask, love 'em or hate 'em?
I've come to really appreciate the value of editing. I have a very good friend that is also my editor, and she does a fantastic job in not only reading the story and telling me where maybe some of my plot points are a little bit weak, but she has an excellent command of punctuation and grammar and usage. It allows me to write and hand it over to her, and she fixes things, and that makes it a pleasure. Probably 99% of the time agree with the changes that she suggests, and I'm very lucky to have someone that does that for me.
Is she a professional editor?
She is not, but she's a very intelligent person, a very close friend of mine. She is an avid reader, I believe could be a good writer herself. She does as good of a job as a professional editor might, maybe even more so in that she contributes to ideas in the story that may need strengthening.
Has a professional editor ever gone over her work and disagreed with what she's done?
I've not done that, but today with the internet, there are several sites that are collectives of other writers, and you can put writing up onto those sites and get suggestions from hundreds and even thousands of other writers that will read your work and tell you where things aren't measuring up. And that may even be more effective than having a single editor that lays down the law, in that you can look at those comments and take what you think is valuable and run with those.
There's quite a bit of you in the book.
Well, there are things in the book in terms of the move that the character makes that are parallel to my own life. There are also some other things. The character not only is a detective, I'm not a detective or anything of that nature, but he plays the piano, came from a musical family. That is very much in line with my own life. So there are elements where I'm very comfortable writing about what the character is doing because I've done those things myself.
Tell me more about Frankly Speaking.
This book basically sets up the introduction to Frank Rozzani as a character. He is a detective that takes cases that the police have not been able to close. This particular book centers around the kidnapping of a 16-year-old girl from a church retreat. You have to understand that Jacksonville is a very conservative area. The police automatically treat her kidnapping as a runaway situation. The parents of the girl do not believe that she's run away, and they enlist Frank and his team to find out what exactly happened to the girl. The book centers around the investigation, and there are many twists and turns before it finally comes to resolution without giving away any of the details.
Is your main character a private investigator?
He is. He's a former police officer that became a private investigator through some tragic events that happened to him while he was a police officer.
Most of the private investigator stories I've ever read always seem to have an antagonistic approach to the PI as compared to a good working relationship. Is that the case in your stories? Because you said that the police come to him when they can't solve a crime.
It's kind of a mixture in this book. Actually, Frank takes on the case because the police have concluded that it's a runaway situation, and the girl's parents don't believe that it is, so they hire him to kind of check up on what the police have done in their procedure. So there is some resentment there. But the twist here is that there's one police officer that is a friend of Frank's and actually helps him unbeknownst to her superiors during the book. So there's that relationship with the police. There's that respect that he was a former police officer. As I get further down the road in this book series, there'll be more of a positive relationship between Frank and the police.
How'd you come up with the title?
It's really just a play on Frank Rozzani's first name. If I've painted myself into a corner with the titles of future books in this series, this is probably it. In fact, I have a newsletter that I put out, and I'm running a contest in the newsletter for readers to help me come up with a title to the second book. Their reward will be that their name will appear as one of the characters in the book. But I will continue to use the word Frank in the title, so I have several suggestions, some of them creative, some of them R and X-rated that could never be book titles. I'm still working towards coming up with the title for the next book following along in that same theme.
How many hours a week do you spend writing?
That's an interesting question. It really depends on my workload. I work in probably a 50 to 60 hour a week consulting job, but I do travel a lot. I do have a lot of downtime in hotels as I travel. So I probably spend 14 to 15 hours a week writing, in evenings, late nights, early mornings, travel time, and so on.
Are you self or traditionally published?
I am self-published. When I started this writing endeavor, I kind of looked my nose down at self-published authors, thinking that they were authors who could not catch on. When I first started this writing endeavor, I tended to look my nose down at other self-published authors. I thought that their work was inferior because they couldn't get a publishing company to endorse their work and validate it and so on. And then I came across an author named Hugh Howey, who I'm sure you've heard of. He is kind of the evangelist of self-publishing and has been quite successful with self-publishing and has helped other authors in terms of giving them tips and pointers on how to be a success with self-publishing. I've followed that model, found that there's quite a brotherhood of other self-published authors out there, and we support each other, and it's been very rewarding being part of that community. So I no longer look down my nose at self-published authors, although there is still that stigma. I think it's starting to go away somewhat.
What's hardest, writing, getting published, or marketing?
Marketing, without a doubt. I am not one who toots his own horn and pats myself on the back, and it's very difficult for me to get on social media or on my website and tell everyone how wonderful I am. I'm very thankful for platforms like this where I can tell you how wonderful I am, and you can agree or disagree as you put your podcast out there on the internet.
Just go on to Facebook and you can find the Department of Redundancy department. Every author goes to every different room, spends 30 milliseconds telling them, me, buy my book, free, or 99 cents for this week only. Instead of having an organization behind you, such as Eat, Sleep, Write, or any other firm that will push your work properly and clearly in leaving you free and clear.
Started out that way. I started out posting to all of the rooms. I would get very discouraged because you'd look at your sales report and it would remain flat. And then all of a sudden, just as you're about to give up, you'd see one or two sales trickle through and you think, wow, it's working. And then I realized that most of the sales that I was getting came from things like reviews, word of mouth. I've had a great deal of success with other friends that have read my book, sharing their thoughts on the book, either in Amazon or on Facebook or other social media. And that's been very helpful. I think word of mouth and third parties validating the work can be much more valuable than you self-promoting in every single writer's group, as you mentioned.
What was hardest for you, beginning, middle, or end?
I believe it's the middle, to be honest with you, because usually an author will have a beginning and end in mind when they start to write. But you have to get from the beginning to the end. And it's all of those things in the middle that have to add up. They have to make sense to the reader. They have to make sense in terms of chronology. I remember my first draft of the book, I had one of my characters having a baby, and then I realized that only about 2 weeks had elapsed in the book. So her becoming pregnant and having a baby in 2 weeks was not going to be a realistic scenario. The middle is where I tend to concentrate to make sure that I don't lose the reader and have them scratching their head saying that just doesn't make sense.
Well, you know, Don, there is a reason they call it beginning, muddle, or end.
Correct. I've heard that.
Words of wisdom for aspiring authors.
If you view yourself as being an author, then be one. Don't let other people discourage you. Don't get discouraged. One of the things that I tend to do, you always hear about the myth of writer's block, and I call it a myth where writers hit a wall and they can't write another word. So what I do is I tend to have 2 or 3 different works going on at the same time. And if I hit a wall on one of those works, I'll jump to the other one and just keep that writing process going. Don't give up. Continue to write. If it's what you love to do, then just do it.
You're working on your second novel now. Can you whet our appetites with any information, and when do you expect it to be released?
The book will be released in October. That's the goal that I'm shooting for. It will be a further evolution of not only the main character in the book, but there will be some significant changes for some of the peripheral characters as we go through the story. There'll be some very big changes that will affect their lives and will influence future stories involving these characters.
Where can we find out more about you and your books on the internet?
I have a website. The website will tell you not only about my projects that have been published, but it will give some insight into upcoming projects along with some samples and so on. And that is at donmassenzio.com. Very easy and amazing. No one else had that domain when I went to purchase it, so I was very lucky.
Can you spell out your last name for us?
Massenzio.
Don Massenzio, author of Frankly Speaking, a Frank Rozzani detective novel, the first in a series. Thank you so much for being with me today on the Eat, Sleep, Write podcast.
Adam, thank you so much. You've made this a very wonderful experience, and you've made me not fear interviews in the future.
If you're looking for a community that can offer you tools, support, and advice to start your own adventures in writing, then prepare to have the cauldron of your imagination stirred. I started the Eat, Sleep, Write podcast so more people can understand what it's like to be a writer and to get more eyes on your books. My goal is to help you achieve the success you so richly deserve. I salute your success in writing.
Thank you for listening to another edition of the Eat, Sleep, Write podcast, located at eatsleepwrite.net. Please send any questions, comments or suggestions to comments@eatsleepwrite.net. Please consider a donation to support the Eat, Sleep, Write podcast. Donations can be sent to our PayPal address at donations@eatsleepwrite.net. Once in a lifetime, the theme music for the Eat, Sleep, Write podcast, courtesy of Stephen Paul, all rights reserved, used by permission. Please join us again for the next edition of the Eat, Sleep, Write podcast.